iDAWN.
Bienvenidos a Diving.
Witajcie na festiwalu Dive-In.
Welcome to the Dive-In Festival.
Willkommen zu Dive-In.
Bienvenidos a Wellbeing.
Welcome to Dive-In.
Mabuhay sa Dive-In Kapistahan.
Üdvözlünk a Diving Fesztiválon.
Добро пожаловать на фестиваль Dive-In.
ברוכים הבאים. בואו לצלול איתנו.
ডাইভ ইন উৎসবে আপনাদের সকলকে জানাই সাদর আমন্ত্রণ।
Diving'e yokoso.
Benvenuti al Diving Festival.
Diving Festivali'ne hoş geldiniz.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you here today and to be moderator of our discussion. I'm Carl Helgeson. I'm the Chief Claims Officer at RSA, and the event itself today is really a collaboration between ArgoGlobal, iDAWN and RSA, and it's centred around how we can prioritise mental health before, during and after Covid-19. And we're going to start proceedings with a short video. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tony. I think the biggest impact on my mental health has been a sense of a loss of control. Suddenly I can't go wherever I want to go or do whatever I want to do. I'm restricted and I don't know how long that restriction is going to be. So I think to combat that, I have been making sure that I exercise. I have been spending time with my family, both as a family, but then also with my wife as a couple. And I've not tried to do anything too complicated, because I think then you actually stress yourself out by having this long list of things to do. I think what's kept me grounded is probably the children, but then equally the dog. She certainly doesn't care about what's going on and wants me when I'm there. So I suppose once again, kind of exercise, family time, and not trying to over clutter my life just because something strange and unusual is happening in the world.
You can get a bit overwhelmed in trying to deal with all the advice that people give you on managing mental health during this time. I haven't found one magic solution in my experience. It's usually a combination of different things, and you have to figure out what works best for you. And for me, it's exercise, spending time with family and friends, and building a routine where I can. The biggest piece of advice I would give is talk about it and ask for help. Don't leave it as late as I did. The problem will get worse, and you will find that there's no need to feel worried, ashamed or guilty when you talk to people about it and ask for help in dealing with it.
Living alone during COVID's had its challenges. It was quite depressing for the first few weeks. I didn't see anybody whatsoever. But when I spoke to some friends who have families, I realised they have their own challenges too. It's a very difficult time for everybody. I guess the monotony for me, especially being on my own all day, was quite getting me down. I'm lucky I have work flexibility at AIG, so I've just been chopping up my days and going for walks regularly at different times of the day, just to give some variety.
So the biggest impact I think I've experienced during the pandemic is really around those blurred work lines between family and home life and work, and never knowing when to stop work and just working because it's in my home. The advice I would give to others is to just try and create structure and get your home work life to mirror your work life. Create as much structure and remove the ambiguity and control what you can. In terms of how I've stayed grounded, I get dressed for work in the morning, I go for a walk at the start of the day, I take a lunch break, I go for a walk at the end of the day, I keep talking to my team, to my family, and most importantly, don't watch social media.
During early COVID, I had an immense overwhelming feeling of failure and not being able to cope. The importance of getting out there safely and seeing the world for myself, not through social media, was the best antidote for me. I'd advise anyone to positively influence their mental health by listening to the facts and doing things to bring light into your life. Get out and see how life is adapting outside your own front door. My children keep me grounded, and it's picking my battle some days. You know what, it's okay that they spend hours online gaming, as it's the only way that they're interacting with their friends right now. We've not been ill and we're safe.
Hi there, so I wanted to address the question of looking after your mental health during this coronavirus outbreak. So one thing I think is that there's always things on our mind and things that worry us and drag us down a bit. We don't always have a proper sense of awareness of what they are, and I think it's really worth your while taking some time to stop and think about that. And ideally, you know, to take that forward, to find a way to express it, either in writing or talk to a good friend about it. And it's highly unlikely you'll be able to do that in a particularly precise or elaborate way, but, you know, just try and do it and see how it goes. And you'll get a bonus, of course, out of that, in that you'll find out who your friends are, because these are the people you can talk to and share things like that.
I've spoken to quite a lot of people in our business during the remote working period that we've been in, and it's pretty clear that no two sets of circumstances are the same. But I think whether you're dual parenting or living on your own, it's really important to be clear about what you have to deliver each day, but then make sure that you take time out to remain fresh, whether that's exercising or spending time with your families. I think that's the best way that we can stay mentally fresh.
Great. Okay. Well, the video that you've just watched, I think, really highlights some of the key impacts that people have experienced on their mental health, but also helpfully shared some of the things that we've all learnt probably during this time to adapt and ensure our mental well-being remains a priority. Since the pandemic took hold, you know, people have been forced to stay at home for extended periods, and many have felt alone, or they're having to balance home working life with childcare, and that can be incredibly tough. You know, it's no surprise that the effects of mental health being caused by the virus are considerable through added stress, greater anxiety, and longer spells of isolation. And indeed, statistics published by the Mental Health Foundation about loneliness said that around 10% of adults in the UK reported feeling lonely prior to the pandemic. And then by early April, just 2 weeks into the lockdown, this figure had jumped to 24%, as people felt the effects of not only the lockdown, but of social distancing as well, and not being able to see loved ones. The rate among young adults under 25 nearly tripled in the same period to 44%, so some really stark statistics. And isolation is just one of the impacts that we'll pick up on today during the discussion. I mean, personally, I think from my perspective, many of the observations on that video really resonate with me. You know, I think even, you know, I would say I'm naturally introverted, but the lack of sort of social interaction on a day-to-day basis, I have to say I've found really tough over the last 6 months. I find the repetition from moving from one room in my house to another room in my house and not really getting out and about as I would have been used to historically, really challenging and tiring. And I think one of the comments in that video as well about taking breaks, and I have to say that's something I've had to work incredibly hard on, because it's very easy to just go from one call to the next call with no time at all, and before you know it, your day has completely gone. And if anything, it's felt far more intense than working in the office environment, because you miss those social cues, those snatch conversations, and even the short break you get from moving between meeting rooms. But we also know, I think, unfortunately, that COVID is here certainly to stay in the short to medium term. So it's important that we think about the fact this is a marathon, it's not a sprint, and therefore we need to continue to boost our mental well-being, our energy levels and resilience during this time. And we hope that today's discussion will be helpful to share some tips and advice from the panelists themselves. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end. So as we go through, please do post your questions and we'll pick them up a bit later in the WebEx. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. And I'm going to start first of all with Charles, if you don't mind. If you could perhaps introduce yourself, Charles, and maybe share some reflections on, the challenges that you've faced with mental health during this period.
Sure, excellent. Thank you, Carl, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you today. My name's Charles Alberts, and I'm from ArgoGlobal. I work in our health business, which is basically a part of ArgoGlobal's business, where we help employers to enhance and protect the health and well-being of their employees. I'm also actively involved in our diversity and inclusion work, in particular our mental health group, which is an area where I'm incredibly passionate about. I think if I reflect on the situation over the past few months, perhaps a positive or a silver lining is that I think mental health has come a lot more into our consciousness than ever before. I think even through the news and those around us, we can practically see just what large numbers of people are impacted by issues such as loneliness, isolation, feeling anxious about the world around them. And I think perhaps some of this has helped to bring people together, be that colleagues, family members, or even the community, our neighbours around us, in finding ways to support one another, both in and out of the workplace. And to me, that's only a good thing.
Great. Thank you for that, Charles. Richard, could I turn to you, please? Well, I think you're on mute, Richard.
Yeah, sorry. Yep, I just noticed that just in time. Thank you, Carl. I'm Richard Martin, and I work for a workplace consultancy called Wellbeing. We exist to create kind of fairer and more productive workplaces, and I do lots of training around mental health and related issues. I guess I'd echo a lot of what Charles and Carl have said in terms of experience of COVID. And maybe one of the things I would say more than anything else is that there's been the things that we know we need to do to maintain a good sense of mental health and well-being, they tend to have happened. We tend to have built up lives that make those things happen naturally in ordinary course. And I think what's really been brought home to me during COVID has been the need to actually focus consciously on those things. They're no longer happening so naturally, and we need to make sure that we do positively take the time to do the things that we need to be doing. And I think what Carl was saying around this being a marathon, not a sprint, I think one of the things that we saw in the early days was people running around balancing all sorts of different things and coping for a while. But it was that reality that, no, this is something that is a long-term thing, and we need to make sure that we create ways of being and working and living that ensure that it's sustainable over that long period of time. And of course, with today's announcement in the UK, at least, around the government advice changing to work again at home if you can work from home, I think it's a recognition of the fact that this is something that we need to be focusing. I guess the one other thing I'd say in terms of my own experience was that I was lucky enough to have a couple of weeks off in the summer. That did mean that I then had 2 weeks in quarantine, which was kind of a flip side. But I recognised when I got to that break just how busy and just how under pressure and stressed I had been leading up to that time. And it was only really when I stopped working that I was able to see just how much that kind of stress over the previous 4, 5, 6 months had been.
Very good. Thank you, Richard. Vicky, could I turn to you, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Vicky Lefebvre and I'm the Group Head of Talent at Argo Group. I think certainly everything that's been said so far around how COVID's impacted my own mental health has really resonated. Definitely seen fluctuations in my own moods, depending on how much sleep I'd had, exercise, whether I've been able to get outside during the day, how many video calls I'd been in on each day. And I think to Richard's point, I took a week off and only at that point realised how burnt out I was feeling just by the stresses of this environment. So I agree. I think that the positive of this is that mental health has really come to the forefront in terms of the way that organisations are looking at supporting their employees, and I'm hoping that that's something that will continue over time.
Great. Thank you, Vicky. And now on to probably the first of our questions. Richard, if I could turn to you, if you don't mind. Could you perhaps share a bit about your story and what led you to be a champion for raising awareness about mental health?
Thanks, Carl. Somebody wise once told me that the best causes are the ones that choose you, and I was sort of chosen back in 2011. I'd had at that stage, I was 41. I had 3 lovely children, a lovely wife, lovely house, lovely job. I was involved in all sorts of things in the community, and anybody looking at me at that point would have said, he's doing all right. I probably would have said the same from inside. It felt like going pretty well. I was under a bit of pressure, but I kind of expected that. I had a big job. I was a partner in a law firm. My next job was going to be running the law firm. So there was quite a lot on, and with a young family as well. But I kind of thought, well, just get through the next day or the next week or the next month and so it'll get better. And of course, that was somewhat naive. And I went on holiday with the family in May 2011, expecting to spend a week off work. And I never went back. On the journey home, we were driving around the périphérique, the mode south of Paris, and I had what I now know was a panic attack. I didn't know what it was at the time. All I knew at the time was I felt deathly ill and desperate also just to get away from where I was. So we were in a lot of fast traffic, and I just stopped the car and got out and started walking across all sorts of lanes of traffic to get away from where I was, which clearly wasn't a very good idea. But I was sort of rescued from that situation, came home and spent a month in hospital learning what had happened to me, and also then finding ways of being able to re-engage with the world, which took another 2 years after hospital. It was a good 2 years before I returned to work. And when I got to that point, recognised that I didn't feel able to return to the law. What I wanted to do was to understand more of what had happened to me and why nobody around me included, had recognised what was going on. So I kind of naturally found my way into Berndean. Berndean is all about creating kinder, fairer, more productive workplaces. And I recognised what we needed to be doing more than we had been doing, both within our work at Berndean, but also more generally, was just being aware of mental health and putting on the agenda for people in organisations, both in terms of recognising and looking after one's own self, but also then enabling people to have better quality conversations. And it's been fantastic to be part of the journey, I guess, that we made over the last 5-6 years in terms of making this something that is absolutely rightly on the agenda for most businesses. I could tell you lots of stories along the way. I'll tell you one little story actually, just to kind of bring it home, because by the time I'd got to a point of being ill, that my family and I realised that we could no longer kind of coexist in the same house. We were falling apart in a big way. I had a conversation with my psychiatrist in which he said, "Richard, do you want to be admitted to hospital?" I said to him, "Well, I don't know. You're the psychiatrist. What do you think?" And he said, no, it's all about what you think. So I asked him, I said, am I ill enough to be admitted to hospital, first of all? And he said, yeah, you are definitely ill enough to be admitted to hospital. Don't worry about that. Okay, I said, so what are they like in there? And he said, well, they're like you. And that was one of those conversations that has often dealt with me for many years, because it really brought home to me the idea that, this mental health business, it's not about other people. I'd kind of been aware that there was this thing called mental health and mental illness, but I'd kind of assumed it was about other people, and had kind of kept it safely tucked away in a cupboard in that kind of way. And that was a real eye-opener to say, no, this is all of us. And sure enough, when I got to hospital, we were the people in the hospital were like me. They were like you. They were like our colleagues, our friends, our members. And I think that's the kind of one thing that I've really carried through with me over the years since then, that this is something that we all need to be taking seriously. And I guess, you know, as the other people on the panel have said, and the people you have said, and lots of people have experienced during COVID, it is something that affects us all.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, no, an incredibly powerful story and a case study as well in that context. So thank you. And Vicky, if I could turn to you, you know, what are some of the things that you've observed really about leadership and how that's changed during this time? You know, I guess in terms of how leaders have supported their team members' well-being, for example.
Yeah, I think there's been a real shift actually in how we've expected our leaders to act, to behave, and to manage their people. So I think I'd look at it as two main points really. So I think leadership has needed to be much more high touch in this environment. So much more planful about how they communicate with their team. At an organisational level, we've scheduled frequent all employee meetings. We've had Q&A sessions. At a team level, we've seen more frequent team meetings, more frequent one-to-ones, as well as really those informal check-ins to check how someone's doing. I think what's missing from the virtual environment is that just conversation at the water cooler or quick chat over a coffee. It's really difficult to pick up on those visual cues about how someone's doing. So I think people have had to be much more comfortable around actually opening up and being vulnerable and being authentic and saying, I'm struggling as well. How are you all doing? To really open up that conversation within teams and make it normal to talk about those kind of things. And I think it was Richard that said this, which I think also kind of makes it more the norm. So secondly, I think the pandemic's really accelerated the trend towards flexible working and working at home, remote working. I think even the most traditional leaders amongst us have realised that it's possible for a business to operate completely virtually. I do think that as this becomes the new normal and we realise that I think a greater proportion of people are going to be working from home going forward, regardless of whether there's a pandemic on or not, I think we've got to think about how we replicate the things that are normal in an office environment. So the daily social interaction, the water cooler moments, as I mentioned before, the on-the-job training, the work shadowing, that I think it's difficult to replicate in this virtual environment. So yeah, that's been my observations to date.
Great, Vicky, thank you for that, really helpful. And Charles, if I could turn to you, if you wouldn't mind, which groups of individuals do you think have been most adversely affected during this period from a mental health perspective, and what do you think organisations can do to support?
Yeah, I mean, I think Richard summed it up nicely that, well, everyone has been impacted. All of us, you know, have been impacted by COVID-19 in one way or another, and whether, you know, it's about us just worrying about what's going on around the world and not having control over, to perhaps being more severely anxious around perhaps, you know, catching the virus or us becoming ill or a family member. We've all been impacted by it. I think that there are some groups, of course, who are even more impacted by it due to their circumstances, and have required just an extra level of care and attention from those around them. So think, for instance, those with caring responsibilities. So we know how difficult it is to, you know, homeschool, and some people have not only had children at home, but they might have also had parents, you know, who they've been looking after as well, and just that in itself just increases the amount of pressure that people are under, whilst also trying to work at the same time. So I think definitely, if you've had caring responsibilities, this has been particularly challenging. I think the other group of people, of course, are those who are more vulnerable from a health perspective. That's introduced additional challenges, complexities, needing to isolate from others, and not having nearly as much social contact, not even being able to leave your house. And I think, unfortunately, we've also seen a large increase in domestic violence and domestic abuse cases. So, of course, when you're not in a good relationship and you are stuck at home with that person, then that makes that situation even more difficult. And that's something that I've been particularly, worried about over this time. We have already spoken about loneliness and isolation, and so many people who were already feeling lonely before COVID-19 that the pandemic's just made that situation even worse for them and more others. And of course, those who don't live near loved ones, particularly have been impacted as well, because you can feel totally alone as well. And the list is absolutely endless. I can carry on. I promise I won't. I think the one thing that I've definitely learned through this period is just don't make any assumptions about people. We don't always know what's going on for them at home, in their personal lives, and also in their minds. So always be kind, always keep an open mind as well. And I think from an employer perspective, I've seen so many great examples of employers really stepping up to provide, additional support and care to their employees in the current time. I love this rise of the more human organization. So where we recognize that we're all people, we're all fallible, and we all face challenges. And I hope that to really see that continue beyond the pandemic. We've seen more flexibility being introduced, so perhaps starting later, and finishing later as well, or, being able to do personal things during the day. For a lot of people, that's been really useful. Let's continue to do that in the future. And I've also seen, and I think Vicky kind of referenced obviously leadership, and I've seen line managers really step up during this period. We've really recognised how important the line manager's role is in, keeping an eye out for their team members and supporting them during this period. And that job's been even harder. I think line managers have been impacted as well, yet they've been ones who also need to look after others. So to help support them, I think is quite important, including offering things like training. Some managers just need to be better equipped with the knowledge and skill to be able to manage their teams. And I hope that we'll see a lot more of that take place in the future.
Great. Thank you, Charles, and some good advice and reflections there as well. Richard, if I can turn to you, if I may, how do you think COVID-19 has impacted the stigma around mental health?
Well, I think it's a particularly good indication that we've got 530 people dialed into a webinar about mental health, which I don't think would have happened previously. So I think, well, one of the initiatives, one of the campaigns I'm involved with is something called the This Is Me campaign, which is something driven by the Lord Mayor of London, but it's across the UK and wider afield than that. But that's about using the power of storytelling to break down stigma, to reduce the stigma that surrounds mental illness. And it's a very simple thing about getting people in organisations to tell straightforward stories about the fact that, my name's Richard, I work in the tax department, I like watching football, I like spending time with my kids, oh, and by the way, I experience problems with anxiety, or whatever it might be. Very simple, straightforward stories. And we've seen through looking at the impact of that campaign how much a difference to an organisation's culture storytelling can make. And I guess, well, it's one of the things we can always say, that if the statistics around mental illness that talk about 1 in 4 adults having mental illness during the course of any 1 year, if that stat is true, then we all have a story to tell. And if we would only be more brave to tell those stories, whether they're about ourselves or somebody very close to us, then we would do huge amounts to reduce the stigma. But I think what's happened, to your question, what's happened in COVID is, and it's not everywhere, but in a lot of sense of families and friendship groups and all the telling their stories. Only, small stories about how they're experiencing COVID, but admitting or acknowledging or recognizing that what we're all going through is having an individual impact upon us. And that's been fantastic. And whether that's in, as I say, groups at work or friendship groups or whatever, but just that simple point of saying, yeah, I'm finding this hard and this is how it's affecting me. And that just enables other people, and particularly as Vicky was talking about with leaders, if we can, and one of the questions that has come through on the Q&A is around this, I think, in terms of an executive team and how can we get them to open up, but just helping them recognize that it is safe to do it, and that once one has acknowledged that this is hard and it is affecting all of us individually, it enables other people to do the same. And then it enables us to be supportive of each other until we're able to have that conversation and acknowledge what we may be struggling with or finding hard, even if it's not that extent of struggling. Then we can be supportive to each other, but until we're able to do that, we can't. So I would say it's been very positive from the stigma perspective.
Thanks, Richard. And Vicky, if I could turn to you, I guess the same question really. How do you think about COVID-19 and its impact on the stigma around mental health?
I mean, I agree with Richard, really. It's definitely not removed it, but reduced it for sure. It's higher on the agenda from a leadership standpoint. It's what we're all talking about. How do we support our employees through these struggles? I think what's been really helpful at Argo is we've been running some mental health awareness training. We did it before COVID, but also during with Wellbeing, and it's been super helpful and really powerful to, in teams, hear people's own experiences of dealing with these kinds of things. And I think to the question in the Q&A, if the exec team could be brought together with an expert and have them share some of their own experiences. Everybody's on a mental health journey, regardless of whereabouts on that journey they are. So I just think it's going to keep being on top of the agenda, or certainly on the agenda going forward, because if we talk about the importance of bringing your whole self to work, it's part of us all. So it has to be on the agenda for us going forward.
Completely agree, Vicky. Thank you. And Charles, if I could turn to you, if I may, I guess the same question. Any reflections?
I mean, I would absolutely agree with what Richard and Vicky have said. Obviously, I think from a stigma perspective, we need to recognise, of course, that is when we lack awareness, when we perhaps don't understand something well enough. So we tend to look at it differently, or we tend to perhaps, think about someone who might be struggling with their mental health differently, and we might, inadvertently discriminate against that person, and that's not good for anyone at all. And I think in this current time, we've been talking so much more about mental health. I've seen it in families, my family included. It's been a lot more on the news. And I've seen many employers who didn't really talk much about mental health before COVID-19 suddenly, really put it on the agenda. Senior leaders are starting to talk about it. Richard referenced storytelling, which I've seen more of, if not in video format, in written articles. And I think that's, that's only a positive thing. But I also need to think it's important to remember that we've still got a long way to go. There's still many people who don't understand mental health, and I still think we have a lot of education to do. So our work here is not done yet, but even, just everyone attending today's call and just hearing about people talking about it is a really positive step.
Great, thanks for that, Charles. Vicky, a question for you, if I may. To what extent has mental health, I guess, been part of the D&I agenda until now, and do you think that will change or develop as we look forward?
I think that this varies really depending on which organisation you're a part of, but I think in the comments this morning, in the opening comments to the festival this morning, it was referenced that insurance has been moving along at a glacial pace. I think that's absolutely fair, and I think as a result of that, it's easier to focus on the things that are more visible, to those visible diverse groups, to those groups that are, where progress is easier to measure. So I think certainly from my perspective, it hasn't been part of our agenda to date. I hope that will change in future. I think it has to. As I've said before, it's part of how all of us are made. And you know, I'm increasingly hearing in employee relations issues, in complaints, grievances, that these mental health issues are being brought up, and we all need to understand how to deal with them and how to support people that are struggling. It's a fact of life. So not to answer the question, not really that much to date, but I'm hoping that will change going forward.
Great, thank you, Vicky. And Richard, could you possibly tell us a bit more about the Mindful Business Charter that you helped to lead on, and how that, I guess that's been particularly relevant at this current time?
Sure, thank you. So the Mindful Business Charter is something that began in 2018, so way before COVID. And what it is, it's about, it begins with a recognition that when we are stressed, our brains don't work very well. And that's not very good for us as individuals, but it's also not very good for the work that we do, whether for our own organizations or for our clients or other people we work with. And stress that we experience comes from our own heads. Some of it comes from the way in which we work within our organizations, but a lot of it comes from the way in which we work between our organizations, so with our clients or suppliers and others. And the Mindful Business Charter is about getting organizations together to collaborate and to create a framework and a permission for discussion and thought around what are the causes of unnecessary stress. You know, some of the stress, some of the pressure we experience just goes with the territory, but there's a lot of stuff that is unnecessary. And if we could try to identify some of those unnecessary causes of stress and remove them, then we'd be able to create healthier and more effective ways of working. So it's all about collaboration. It's built around a number of pillars which are looking at particular aspects of how we work. But at its heart, it is about creating permission for me, for example, as a supplier, to push back to you and to say, you know, when you ask me to do X, Y, Z, that creates problems because of this, or, you know, you've asked for this to be turned around over the weekend, that's fine, we'll do it if we needed to do it, but actually if you don't need it until Tuesday, then could we, you know, leave it until then? And because I know that you have bought into it, because you have signed up to the Charter and to this way of working, I have permission to be brave and to push back in that way. So, yeah, in a nutshell, it is about getting organizations talking to each other and thinking with each other about the ways in which they work, being more aware of the impact that organizations have on each other and on the individuals working within those organizations, so that we can then, through having talked about it, have a more meaningful conversation and thought around what can we do to reduce some of the unnecessary stress, which, as I say, will hopefully make us work more healthily but also more productively. And I guess I'd say it's an initiative that began in the legal profession. It was lawyers at Barclays Bank talking to some panel law firms, and it's grown from its origins with 3 organizations to now 55 organizations, and it's growing all of the time. And although its roots are in the legal profession, the kind of issues that it's looking to address and the solutions that it comes up with are as applicable to any other part of industry or business as the legal profession. And whilst its origins pre-COVID, a lot of the stuff that it talks about around how do we manage our different aspects of our lives and how do we create some boundaries and protections to enable us to thrive, do what we want to be doing, have become even more kind of focused in COVID, now that that kind of collision between our workspace and our home has happened so dramatically.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you. Charles, could I ask you, would you mind telling us a little more about mental health first aid and why you think businesses should invest in this provision? What's the impact that you've personally seen?
Okay, yeah, sure. I think mental health first aid is something that's really risen up the agenda in the last few years, and you can think of it as being similar to physical first aid that you might have in the office. So it is training colleagues, people at work, to be first aiders, but from a mental health perspective. So essentially the training would help someone to understand different mental health conditions in a bit more detail, equips them to, say, spot the signs of distress in someone. So if they are going through a difficult period or perhaps are experiencing something a bit more severe like psychological distress. And it also teaches you the soft skills of how to then reach out to someone and to provide support to them in that particular moment. And importantly, I think it doesn't teach you to be a clinician, and that's really important to differentiate. It doesn't teach you to diagnose someone or to treat someone. It just gives you a higher level of mental health knowledge so that you can spot signs in yourself and in others and then reach out to them to provide support. I think from what I've seen, both in AON and in some other organisations, it can be really powerful to have this level of support available. But at the same time, you have to think really carefully about, who of a mental health first aider, because you don't want the role itself and perhaps some of the conversations that that employee might be having to negatively impact their mental health as well. And then how you roll it out, so how you communicate it to the business, and especially around things like what is the role, but also what it isn't. Is it, for instance, okay to call someone at 8 o'clock at night when you know that at home or not? Setting those kind of boundaries, I think, are really important. And I've alluded to, but also, making sure that you protect your mental health first aiders is absolutely, critical. But launching it, I think, is just part of what's important to do. Of course, then you've got to make sure that people are reminded that mental health first aiders are there and that they actually reach out to them. Now, some employees might have some perhaps fears around this, around things like confidentiality, or they might be a bit unsure about talking to a colleague. So that kind of constantly communicating and reassuring people about what the role is there to do is really important. At AON, we launched mental health first aid as part of our mental health strategy back in 2018 now, and I have to say we've been really pleasantly surprised by the number of interactions that our colleagues have had with our mental health first aiders. The feedback on those mental health first aiders has been incredibly positive, and it's great that it's been rewarding for mental health first aiders themselves as well. And I'm one of them. So I think from our perspective, it definitely has been a great initiative to launch, but hopefully I just explained that it does have to be thought through carefully, both in terms of how it's set up and then deployed in the organisation.
Great, thank you, Charles. Now I'm very conscious of time as well, and we've got some great questions coming through on the Q&A. So I'm going to ask one final question before we move on to the questions that we've had from our attendees today. Vicky, if you wouldn't mind, could I just ask, in terms of if we look forward, what do you think some of the mental health challenges will be that we might face when we start to return effectively to the workplace?
I think we're going to have people experiencing increased anxiety just given the amount of time that people have been at home in this kind of safe, cocooned environment. I think it depends whether we've got a vaccine. It depends on whether support structures are still broken, as they are in some cases. I think all of these things are going to contribute to how somebody's feeling about returning to work. Also, the whole financial impact on businesses, which I think is yet to be seen in some areas. It's more prevalent already in travel and tourism and hospitality, but I think people are going to be worried and concerned for their job security as well. So we all need to be mindful of that as we go back into the workplace.
Yes, no, completely agree, Vicky. Thank you. So I'm conscious we've had some great questions. So if it's okay, I'm going to move us on to look at some of those questions. So the first one here that we've received from Alan is, what would you suggest firms can do to better support new starters and ensuring that they don't feel isolated or experience sort of challenges with their mental health? And Richard, do you mind if I could come to you for that one, please?
No, that's fine. Thank you. I think it's a very good question, because I'm conscious that, for example, a number of people on the panel, we have been in our organisations for perhaps many years, and so we've got a fairly strong sense of belonging and relationships with people to fall back on, so that the isolation that we might have been experiencing through COVID, we've had something to sustain us through that, if you like, whereas somebody joining an organisation, clearly there's less of that. I think that I'd suggest a number of different things. The first thing, to talk to people. If you want to know what people need, talk to them, ask them, and ask in a way that makes it clear that you really do want to know the answer and that you're then going to kind of action it. I think creating some sense of certainty will be helpful, and of course that's hard in these times when we really don't know what's happening from day to day, and the government advice is changing day to day, etc. But if I know what I am planning, if I know what's coming, it's more easy to kind of work through it. It's that not knowing whether, today I'm supposed to be going to work, tomorrow I'm not supposed to be going to work, the next day I'm supposed to be eating out to help out, the next day I should be keeping to a group of whatever. So the constant changing isn't helpful, and if we can create some certainty around our organisations. For example, one of the clients that I work with a lot, and I know not everybody will be able to do this, but went out very early on in COVID and said, look, we guarantee that there will be no job losses for a year. And that just took a big worry out from everybody, which meant that, it was more easy to focus on the other bits and pieces that were going on. So certainty, I think, if we are going to be in a situation where we're having people working remotely on an ongoing basis, whether that's all of the time or some of the time, making sure that people do have the facilities to work safely and effectively at home. And that might be a very practical stuff about having a desk and a chair and things like that. And so talking individually with people about that. I think creating networks would be really helpful. So one of the organisations I'm working with, for example, has said, look, we don't want people back in the office, but we know that a lot of our people work in, within a few miles of central London, and they can, if they want to, and obviously government advice may change, but they could get together either virtually or physically in small little groups to be those kind of supportive networks that we might have established ourselves over years at work, but which new people joining won't be able to do. And then I think just don't forget the basics of just what it's like. If you try to put yourself in the shoes of somebody new joining an organization, try to imagine what it is like for them and what are the things that you would ordinarily need to be doing to include them, and then work out how that happens in this situation. And there isn't any substitute for thinking about it and talking about it. But taking the time, and it will probably take more time, finding time one-on-one just to talk to people, whether over VC or whatever, in order to help them feel part of the organisation, and also to understand what their role is in the organisation and get that sense of common purpose that would ordinarily come through the kind of ordinary induction programs that we would ordinarily have.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Charles, if I could come to you, please, for the next one. There's a sort of great reflection and question, really, here from Tim around anxiety, and that concern that under total lockdown is when sometimes people feel calmest because there's clear boundaries. As the rules become more changeable and people start to break them, or we start to see flex around them, then that creates anxiety and uncertainty. And is that something that you've observed more generally as well, with friends, family, work colleagues, for example?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, great question and great point made. Anxiety levels really have increased during COVID-19, and and that's for various reasons, right? People all have different worries that they, things that they might be concerned about, whether that's getting the virus or whether that's about their income, or if it's about their family members, and the list is absolutely endless. I think that for me during this period, one of the things that I've really discovered is mindfulness. And that's really helped me with some of the anxieties that I faced. And in 2019, I went through about a year of therapy, and I remember my therapist always recommending, to try mindfulness, but I don't know why I resisted. But But during the lockdown period, with all of the different pressures that I was facing and things that were being thrown at me, I start every day with just a 10-minute meditation, and that's now just part of my daily routine. And it's had a profound impact on my day, on how I approach things, and also how I think about things. So I think almost the level of anxiety is inevitable, but try and think of ways that you can manage that. For me, it was mindfulness.
Great, thank you, Charles. Thank you for that. Vicky, if I could turn to you, if I may. Great question here around, how can I encourage my exec to open up and discuss mental health? It would help if they can speak about it more and encourage a culture for others to do the same. But we're just not sure how to get them to help. Have you got any reflections in that regard?
Yeah, I think we've touched on this as we've been through the discussion. I think the key point here is really education. So if you can schedule some sort of training with an expert where they can get to know how mental health presents itself in different people, the fact that everybody's on that journey, it's not a weakness, it's not a problem from a work perspective, and get them to talk about their own struggles, because they will inevitably all have them. But I think you almost have to educate in order to have them open up, to create that example for everybody else. I think certainly at Argo we had one leader. They opened up a Q&A session just anonymously before a team meeting, and somebody said that they were really anxious, feeling isolated and really struggling with their work product as a result of that, and they were scared to say anything. And so the leadership team then stood up and said, these are the things that I've been struggling with. I've been having a challenging time from a mental health perspective, childcare, worries, anxiety, all of the things that we've already talked about. So I think if you can get them to feel comfortable being vulnerable and authentic, bringing their whole selves, not just their work persona, to managing and leading people, I think that would be really helpful. But I think education is the first step in that process.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Vicky. Right, we've got lots of questions, but I'm afraid we've probably got time maybe for one more before we sort of move to final reflections, and certainly one or two of those questions I think also align with our final sort of reflections. So there's one here around, and Richard, if I could come to you, Raki, who said, I wasn't afraid to tell my employer I was struggling with stress. They were really open to listening and supporting me, which is great. But I'm concerned whether this could affect my opportunities in the future. And I guess as senior professionals, do you think this fear is justified?
So I would love to say no. I don't think there's any reason for fear whatsoever, that we've cracked stigma, and that you'll be embraced as somebody who is brave enough to acknowledge the fact that sometimes life is hard. I'm not so naive. I think that whilst there are lots of people who are able in their organisations to speak out, that's not going to be the case for everybody, and that may be because of perceptions that are right or wrong. We know from the stats that 9 out of 10 people think that if they talk to their employer about having mental health problems, that they think they would experience less favourable treatment. Now, I hope that stat's not right in the sense that not that many people wouldn't experience discrimination, but I think the reality is there is still quite a lot of stigma out there. I think it's great that, and I've forgotten the name of the questioner, apologies, but it's great that she felt able to speak out in that way, and that speaks volumes, I guess, about the culture of the organisation. And I would hope, therefore, that it wouldn't be something that would impact them going forward. I know. Well, from my own experience, so many years before my sort of major breakdown in 2011, I had an incident when I'd been newly promoted, and I had a very short experience of burnout, I guess. And I know that my employer at the time was very supportive, and certainly that didn't hold me back in any way. But I know also that I was probably quite fortunate. So I think it's a mixed answer. But I hope that helps in some way.
Thanks, Richard. So I'm conscious we've got literally 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of the panel members today just to give a very short, sharp response to this one before we close. And Charles, if I could maybe start with you first, please. Would you be able to share, I guess, one last piece of advice with the audience around, how can we all continue to prioritise our own mental health and maybe that of those around us as well?
From my perspective, it very simply is keep on looking out for one another. You don't have to be a mental health professional in order to support someone around you, in order to have a conversation. And I think for me, the power of colleagues, communities, families coming together in this time, has been profound, and I'd love to see that continue.
Great, thank you, Charles, for that one. Vicky, I guess the same question for you, please.
I think similar to what Charles has said, but if you're struggling, talk to someone. Doesn't have to be someone at work, doesn't have to, a friend, family member, colleague, boss, HR, whoever you feel comfortable talking to, but don't struggle alone, because it's guaranteed that everybody else has had similar experiences, and they'll help you through it.
Thank you, Vicky. And finally, Richard?
So I'd echo what Charles and Vicky have said. I guess I have this idea about starting each day with the question, what do I want to get out today? Whose day is it today? Today is my day. What do I want to get out of today? Because we can spend an awful lot of our time running around chasing after what everybody else wants from us. And if we want to prioritise our own well-being, it would be a good thing to start each day at least with a vague idea of what would I like to get done. And hopefully then I've got some chance of achieving that during the course of the day, whether that's a work thing, whether that's a personal thing, whether it's looking after my well-being, whatever it may be. But whose day is it today? It's my day. What do I want to get out of it?
Great. Thank you, Richard. So look, I think really brings us to the end of our webinar today. And I wanted to say a massive thank you to Charles, Richard and Vicky for participating on our panel today. And of course, everyone for dialing in and attending today's webinar. And I hope you found the conversation and the reflections helpful. Certainly, my takeaways, I think, from the conversation is very much that, obviously, no one is immune to the challenges around our mental health, and it impacts us all in different ways. And equally, there is a real power, I think, and sometimes we have to be brave in being prepared to show a degree of vulnerability, and also to reflect ourselves on how we're feeling, why we're feeling that way, and actually if we can understand it, then perhaps we can take control and do something constructive around managing those challenges. And I really like some of the points around being kind to one another, no assumptions, and ultimately creating that time to listen to our colleagues and creating space to actively do that. And I think, how do we create that personal certainty, that structure, and create some personal time, whether that's through meditation, mindfulness techniques, or just doing something that you find helps you relax and creates a safe space to be able to manage and reinvigorate and energize your mental health as well. So I hope you've all found that really helpful today. Thank you once again, everyone. And yes, that brings us to a close. Thank you.